So hello and welcome to you all to this session on food systems. I'm Rowena Merritt. I'm the Social Behaviour Change Lead for Nutrition at UNICEF headquarters. And I just realised the other day, I love food systems so much, I actually dress my children in clothes that depict the food system. And they're still small, so they let me dress them in such clothes, but I'm sure they'll object in a few years' time. But today's session is all about the food system and about applying behavioural science across each part of the food system. As I've just said, I'm Rowena from UNICEF, but this is very much a joint session between 4 UN organisations, FAO, IFAD, UNICEF and WFP. So a big welcome from all of us here today. Just to give you a little bit of information about this session, we're going to be looking at examples from across the food system, talking about, what worked or what hasn't worked quite as well, sharing some of the key lessons learnt. Don't worry, we're not going to be talking at you for a whole hour. There is going to be lots of time for Q&A, and you can probably see on the system there is a dedicated question and answer box. So during the presentations, if you have any questions, please do add them to that Q&A box. And when each of the speakers have finished talking, we're going to ask them to go into there and try and answer as many questions as we can. And we'll also have a live Q&A session at the end. So just to give you a little bit of context in relation to the food system and why it's so important and what it includes, sometimes it's referred to as the agri-food system. You might have heard that as well. And basically it includes the production, processing, transport and consumption of foods. It looks at the sustainability, the degree to which food is wasted, how food production affects the natural environment, and also people's individual and population health. Now, as you can imagine, food systems are heavily impacted by climate change, but also they're a major contributor to climate change. Just to give you a bit of statistics around this, more than 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by human activity can actually be attributed to the food system in the way that we produce, process, transport and package food. And it's estimated that 1/3 of all food is lost or wasted. So it's really important that we think about the food system, not just from a health and welfare point of view, but also from the climate change agenda. I think the food system is also quite unique because it threads through all 17 of the development goals. So for example, SDG 2, zero hunger, without sustainable and nutritious food production, we can never achieve that. With SDG 5 about gender equality, women are 11% more likely to experience food inequalities. And my final example from SDG 13, as we've just said, food systems are heavily impacted by climate change, but also contribute greatly to climate change. So it's really important that we look at a range of behaviours and we use behavioural science to improve outcomes for all across the food system. So just before we start the presentation, I'm going to ask Joanna to launch the first poll. And this poll is about farmers, just to see what you think the answer might be. So how many farms in the world operate on less than 2 hectares? So if you just vote, and then Joanna, let me know when the votes are in. We'll just leave the poll open for another few seconds. Okay. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, 51% said over 600 million. That is correct. So it's a huge number of farms that are less than 2 hectares. And we're now going to be looking at some examples where we've been working with farmers, where the UN organisations have been working with farmers to improve outcomes. So let me go to the next slide. Courtney, can I just check? Are you there, Courtney?
I sure am.
Perfect. Over to you, Courtney.
Thanks, Rowena. It's for that wonderful introduction and great to be here with you. I'm Courtney Price, and I have the privilege of leading the exploration of behavioral science and FAO as a way to increase program impact and help agri-food system transformation, as a way to also embrace and improve administration and operations efficiency, as well as a way to unlock out-of-the-box thinking and innovation mindset. Our roadmap for exploring behavioral, if I can go back just one slide, our roadmap for behavioral science in FAO is around 4 ideas. 1, generating our own evidence of the potential behavioral science to actually work, engaging early adopters as they transition towards being behavioral science champions, using behavioral science in their own projects, building partnerships with private sector, with academia, and with UN agencies like you see today, and most importantly, empowering country offices and eventually member states to use behavioral science as an innovation approach in more of a mainstream fashion. Next. So diving into the 2 examples I'd like to share with you today, let me highlight one key idea, and that is co-design. Behavioral science as a method or vehicle for working together with different multi-stakeholder groups and designing for change together. Both examples were implemented by the Regional Decision Lab based in FAO Nairobi office, which is a sub-regional area of work, together with service provider Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. The first one is about climate resilient decisions. So what do we mean by climate resilience? Or more importantly, what's the problem? How would we define it using behavioral science as a behavioral point of view? What does lack of resilience look like? Well, the basic idea is that climate information is changing rapidly. The climate change is causing erratic weather, and traditional methods aren't keeping up with these changes, and farmers are having suboptimal yields due to a challenge of choosing the right crops that are more likely to survive the next season. So the behavioral target for this pilot was that farmers would choose more adaptable crops to the climate scenario. The way the Regional Decision Lab designed the intervention was to try to think about how information influences the behaviors of farmers. And the way the 2 treatments they came up with was, the first intervention was around changing the way information is framed, how it's presented. And the second was about what influences changes of decisions, because we don't always make the decision and stick to it, we might change it. So the first was about a standard weather report versus an emotional frame in terms of making the information more salient around things people cared about, like school, community pride, etc. And the second intervention after farmers made their decision was, would their decision be influenced by a conversation with a peer, or perhaps a conversation or directive from an authority? Or would it be influenced by their risk perception? How risk-seeking or risk-averse are they, and does that have an effect? Once we had that design, the Regional Decision Lab tested this in a lab in the field approach with approximately 200 farmers in rural Kenya. Once again, we had these two interventions, and we had these different social influences that we were testing through this methodology using iPads and computers in a lab setting, but in the field. And the results were essentially, people made better decisions. Weather information overall led to more climate smart choices. But interestingly enough, there was no difference between this positive result from treatment and control, meaning the emotional frame and the standard weather frame had the same result. So in a sense, we might say, well, our experiment didn't work, but we learned something really important. And that is, not only are social influences very important, but very few farmers in our sample actually receive climate information. So regardless of the frame, we need to work harder on providing that information to farmers. We also found that social norms are really important, and peer conversations really shifted decision-making. And we also learned something about our own methodologies. Behavioral science isn't a static discipline. It's got a lot of tools that are applied in a lot of places, but risk perception and the classic game we often play to assess it often needs to be updated in terms of context. So I'll just show you the next slide, a picture of what that game is like, many of you may be familiar with the balloon game, but you essentially click a mouse and you have a randomly generated balloon that will pop at a certain number of clicks. Each time the number of clicks changes for each subject randomly. And basically you perceive your risk perception as how big the balloon gets and how much you want to keep clicking before you're going to stop. And this did not work in context. It showed almost 100% of farmers as super risk seeking, but interviews and so much knowledge and traditional knowledge and time spent with farmers reveals that's just not the case. Farmers are risk savvy and they're making really smart decisions to avoid losses. So this is an interesting point where behavioral science also can learn by doing behavioral science. The second example I'd like to share with you is in Mozambique around how to make a slaughterhouse more hygienic. Once again, we define the behavior. What does it mean to have good hygiene in a slaughterhouse? Well, the Decision Lab worked with slaughterhouse workers to understand big challenges, and major challenges were mixing of fresh meat and waste, cross-contamination of microbes, and basically the group came to the consensus they wanted to improve compliance with standard protocols for food safety and proper procedure. The design, but the way they got to the design was a co-innovation workshop where they drew a map, they scoped out the problem, they thought about behavioral barriers together, and they ended up coming up with what sounds like a pretty simple solution, but quite an innovative one. That was, there wasn't the behavioral barrier, was there just people didn't have their own buckets and they didn't have a system for those buckets. So next slide, this is what they came up with. Their process mapped to colors that slaughterhouse workers chose themselves, and icons and graphics and language that they also chose that would have, so they associated with the step in the hygienic process. So what was the result? Basically, we did a before and after field trial to understand if in two different slaughterhouses, rolling out this bucket system would influence behaviors. And what we found next was that overall, observable data was really encouraging. People, when they were observed, did comply with the behaviors they themselves said they wanted to achieve in terms of proper process and hygiene. But overall, when non-observed behavior, when unannounced observation and self-reports, as well as reporting on neighbors, etc., and also microbial load, this wasn't conclusive. However, the huge result was that stakeholders were really excited and invested in the process of co-design. They were convinced that this was a useful method and they needed to try it again. So we saw a real strong partnership built with the field and built with the Mozambique slaughterhouses that we worked with. And there was interest in doing this again, which also shows that behavioral science is not a one-off experiment. You publish in a journal and then you're done. It's an iterative process by learning from the previous experiment, which is so much connected to innovation and innovation thinking. Finally, I just want to talk about how we're growing. The momentum in FAO is growing thanks to behavioral science as a vehicle for innovation and innovative mindsets. We're seeing more and more colleagues interested in using behavioral science for One Health challenges, to reduce food waste, like Rowena talked about earlier, increase food safety, and so many other applications. We're also looking at how behavioral science can influence and benefit policymakers. Will they make pro-poor choices? Will they include critical social and other innovations in their policymaking? And finally, but not in any means less importantly, can we use behavioral science to reduce administrative burdens, to make operations and admin more efficient and more effective? And if you stick around for the next session in the next hour, you'll hear other colleagues from FAO talking about a behavioral science experiment that dramatically increased attendance at a key training where people need key information. So getting people to attend, to do different things that they want to do is a really exciting thing we're exploring in FAO. So I'll just end by saying, it's not just about the program impact or about the admin burdens, but it's also about a vehicle for innovation and out-of-the-box thinking. We've seen our colleagues growing and using behavioral science as an avenue for learning to have a fail-fast culture, being aware and able to try new approaches, and engaging in bottom-up thinking, flipping the narrative, and really empathizing with stakeholders using evidence and scientific method. So we're really excited about where this is going as an area of work inside the Quintet of Change and as an innovation method for FAO and partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And now passing over to my colleague at IFAD. So just passing it over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowena, and thanks for the invitation. I am happy to share IFAD vision in behavioral science. And I wanted to highlight that at IFAD, we are following a systematic approach. For instance, last year, we applied behavioral science in our innovation challenges. We also conducted a evidence gap map with behavioral interventions within the framework of climate change actions. And we just developed a behavioral toolkit for IFAD projects, for IFAD country teams. And today, my presentation, I will be talking about how IFAD is incorporating behavioral science in this operation. Next slide, please, Robina. Thank you. So the challenge that we face is that the design of IFAD project doesn't take into consideration the decision-making process of beneficiaries. Therefore, it was not surprising that some unidentified behavioral barriers appear during project implementation, and country teams don't have the knowledge and instruments on how to diagnose and address these behavioral barriers. So with a team from the Latin American division, we propose a project called Behavioral Mindset Avanzar that has two main components. One is a pilot in the Avanzar Rural project in Peru, specifically in the Chota province in the Cajamarca region, where we apply the behavioral design methodology, the phases of problem definition, behavioral diagnosis, design of solutions and interventions, and testing. And later I will talk about more about this pilot. And the second component is a prototype of a behavioral toolkit. So any IFAD country team can use the behavioral design methodology during project design or implementation. This second component was informed by the result of the pilot and also from interviews from key stakeholders such as country directors, project delivery teams, and others. And it provides IFAD team with important tools, easy to use tools to use it during IFAD project cycle. Next slide, please. So in the pilot, in the first component, the pilot in the Avanzar Rural project, what we did is to apply the behavioral design methodology in a specific challenge that the project was having in Chota, that was a low rural women participation in Avanzar Rural trainings. And together with the implementers, we conduct the behavioral diagnosis, understanding what were the behavioral barriers and differentiating between the structural and behavioral barriers. And then we pass to the solution stage, where we design a notebook to encourage self-reflection during meetings, and also contains a calendar for each month. So the intervention was from November and is finalizing in June. It was a personalized notebook and has a space for note-taking. Then together with our research partner from Peru, we ran a randomized control trial in 60 producer organizations in Chota, where we selected 30 organizations for the treatment group, where we gave this notebook to the extension specialists and also conduct a training on how to conduct these self-affirmation exercises from November to June. And we send monthly reminders on how to conduct this self-affirmation exercise at the beginning of each training. Right now, we are finalizing the implementation, and we are going to do the testing, so we expect results soon. And we are going to share later, when we have the results, what worked and what was not working. And another example where we are applying our behavioral toolkit is also from the Latin American and Division region, and is in a project in Bolivia, where we are currently conducting a behavioral diagnosis to understand what are the potential behavioral barriers that consumers face when attending to agroecological fairs. This is a project that is under design, so we expect to incorporate some potential solutions already in the design phase. And with these two examples from the Latin American region, we are having and implementing the behavioral science in different parts of the IFAD project cycle. One was in implementation, and this second example is in the design phase. And we hope to continue applying and using behavioral science in our IFAD projects, because we believe in the potential impact that behavioral science have for increasing project impact and effectiveness. Thank you, and back to you, Rowena.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. And Joanna, if you could launch the next poll, please. So if people could have a go at answering that question about the amount of bread that's eaten, that would be super. Okay. And Joanna, when the answers are in, if you want to close the poll, please. So most people guessed, well, it was quite close, but most people guessed 5 to 10 kilograms. So thank you very much for having a go at that. And I will pass over to Ivory, who will be able to give you the answer to that question. Over to you, Ivory.
Thanks so much, Rowena. And yeah, thank you also for the opportunity to present an example of how WFP is using behavioral science within the scope of one very successful value chain development project in Armenia. So yeah, you can see the answer to that question is 10.4 kilograms, which is far higher than the recommended amount of white bread per person per month. What I want to do in the scope of this slide is to tell you the story of just one specific project, which was completed by WFP Armenia's country office. So as the poll indicated, people in Armenia consume far higher than the recommended amounts of white bread. And while this is unhealthy, it's very much integrated into the culture of the country. And because of this cultural significance, instead of trying to reduce bread consumption in Armenia, WFP looked at opportunities to support people to switch to a healthier alternative, which was whole grain. And this is how what we call the whole grain wheat value chain project was developed. So the project team embarked on a process of exploring how to design a project which would introduce whole grain into the market. And what they were looking at was specifically issues around the supply side and the demand side for this product. So to better understand the supply side, a value chain analysis was completed, which showed that there really wasn't whole grain available on the market at all, but also that Armenia in general is very reliant on imports for wheat products. And what that means is that if you're supporting farmers within Armenia to increase national production, then you have to think of ways to make sure that they do remain competitive against their international counterparts. On the demand side, behavioral research around bread consumption was completed with lots and lots of different findings, which we'll go into later. But one significant finding, which I want to highlight and which we will come back to later, is that children have significant decision power in deciding what is consumed at home. And then based on all of this research and all of this information, in 2019-2020, a project was designed to simultaneously increase the supply and the demand at each point in the value chain of whole grain wheat. So that was smallholder farmers, that was mills, that was bakeries, and that was consumers, those consumers being either households or perhaps national programs such as the school feeding program. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges around supply and then how behavioral science was used to kind of add value to the activities that WFP was doing. Typically, farmers in Armenia were using very small and scattered plots of land, which was limiting their production potential. Farming in a cooperative where lots of farmers come together to grow a similar quality of product would overcome this because it would allow them to produce at bulk and then be more competitive in the formal market. But what was important was to understand the historical attitudes by farmers in the area towards cooperative farming and then why they perceived risks about it. And this was a process of co-creation. Where are these risk points and what can we do to increase your appetite to this risk so that you can take the opportunity, this profitable opportunity. So based on this, WFP then made these micro investments to reduce that perceived risk for the farmers and motivate them to participate. And importantly, this is a way of programming where you don't see a smallholder farmer as a simple beneficiary of a WFP program, but instead you see them as a collaborator who's part of this process of change with us. And this is really important. Now, after 1 year of this project, we saw that all farmers on their own steam, on their own investment, decided to continue growing in the way that WFP had been recommending. So continue growing whole grain wheat and using crop rotation methods to reduce their reliance on fertilizers. And this was a risk that they wholly took on themselves. And then also we saw more and more farmers in the area adopting this. And this was really through having this co-creation process. Now let's talk a little bit about the barriers around the demand side, which were a lot more substantial and a lot more out of our comfort area, because WFP was trying to introduce a niche product to the market. So what the project team did was to set out to understand which wheat-based products were very popular currently and where could whole grain be used as a replacement. And what we found was that there were major concerns by bakers that they couldn't cook quality products with whole grain wheat. And based on this, extensive trainings were held on how to make not only bread, but cakes, pizzas, whatever the demand was. And these were attended by bakers, by school feeding chefs, by children, by parents, to get a really mass out there. How do you do this? And one of the important things which we did is we recommended a gradual replacement of white wheat with whole grain, as opposed to doing a full change, because what this would mean was that the product still resembled the product where there was that initial demands. And now we all know if you attend one cooking class, you don't become a master, by no means. You will get very enthusiastic, perhaps. You'll buy all of this whole grain wheat flour, you'll go home, you'll make something which is a disaster, and then you'll go back to your initial habits immediately. And this is something we would all do. So in order to reduce that risk, we established a really beautiful training and resource center. And this center kind of takes the Apple model. So if I buy an iPhone, I can go back to an Apple store whenever I want to understand how to maximize the usability of that iPhone for what I need it for. And they will always give me that service so that I really always believe this is the product for me. Similarly, in the Training and Resource Center, I can go in as an individual and say, I want to make this specific biscuit. How do I do that? Please help me. And there's bakers on hand to support with that. Now, importantly, this is an economically viable business. So what they're doing is they have a business model. They're selling niche whole grain products onto the market, so they're sustaining themselves, and then they're offering this support on the side so that they keep that demand going. So it's a way to really balance economic and social outcomes. I don't think we can talk about kind of the utilization of behavioral science without talking about the adoption of social marketing techniques. And we supported value chain actors to really position whole grain products in a niche and valuable position in the market using these commercial marketing strategies for social good. So essentially what we did is we have these co-creation consultation sessions on how to tell a story of the unique value of whole grain products as something that's healthy, as something that's quality, and as something that's rooted in Armenian culture. And what this meant, for example, was that we knew that consumers had concerns that Armenian produced products might be lower quality. So we put in a little window in the packaging so that people could see the product they're buying. In order to show that this was really part of the culture of bread from within Armenia, we also made sure that the packaging was covered in Armenian ornaments and decorations, so it was really clear that this is an Armenian product. And then the final component of sustainable value chain development programming is one where supply and demand are not only maintained, but also snowballed. And we wanted to make sure that we saw an increased demand for whole grain products beyond the scope of the project, because this is far beyond what WFP can do or what the value chain actors we were supporting can do. So we worked with the Ministry of Education to switch white wheat products in the school feeding program to whole grain products in the school feeding program. And this was catalytic. And the reason for this is it goes back to this component of children being the decision makers of what is eaten in the household. If a child is consuming whole grain products in the school and they really enjoy those products, they can go home and say to their parents, please, can we have this kind of bread? and their parents will make that switch according to the research that we did. And therefore, what you have is like a snowball effect beyond the scope of the project just by utilizing some of these behavioral science components. So I will stop there because it's a short presentation. I'm very happy to take questions in the chat. And I also want to take a moment to congratulate my colleagues from Armenia for their excellent implementation for this project. Thanks, Rowena.
Thanks so much, Ivory. Now on to our next presentation. So over to you, Charles, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rohana, and we are so happy to share our experience in using behavior science to support the nutrition program in Burkina Faso. Let me begin with some background information. Slide, please. In
Oh, Charles, I think we've lost you, or is it just me that's lost Charles?
No, we sadly lost him.
I don't hear him.
Okay, I think we've just lost Charles. He might have connection issues. Charles? Okay, whilst we're waiting for Charles to reconnect, I think what we'll do is we'll just skip a few slides forward, if that's okay, and head over to Mexico. So over to Mexico, and Charles, we'll get you connected again. Joanne, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. So, and my video is turned off. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is me. Hello, everyone. I think Charles is back. You want us to go back to Charles' presentation?
We'll stick with you now, and then we'll go back to Charles after you. Now we're on this slide. So we'll go Mexico first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think that there was a logic around this final presentation, which was mine, and it was to prove how you can embed social and behavior science, behavioral science into the governmental office, which is actually quite a challenge. And well, as you might know, and I know that you're all aware that a broken food system can lead to unhealthy diets. And this was particularly the case of Yucatan. Yucatan is a state in the south of Mexico, which has one of the most excruciating levels of obesity and malnutrition in the country, especially because of unhealthy diets and overconsumption of ultra-processed foods. So with all the work that we had done there as UNICEF, we thought that a lot of things that we have been doing already had a lot of social of behavioral science implicit in it. And we had to systematize it. We needed to code it to actually build on something that could be delivered to the government. So they wouldn't have the problem, and we would be solving it with them, but the solution as well. A solution that resided in behavioral change interventions, that resided or that rested in participatory approaches on behavioral science research, on behavioral design. And that's how we started working with the locality, especially with the Ministry of Health, to embed this behavior change and this behavioral science framework in it. So what we tried to define was what were we going to do for the government to actually adopt what is now called the Behavioral Change Program, or PC2. And the thing is that we needed to first make sure that all the personnel from the bottom of the pyramid to the decision makers would know what they were trying to learn around behavioral change. So we did an extensive training in how to build behavioral change interventions. Then we defined a behavioral change program commission, which considers psychologists from different universities, decision makers, UNICEF as well, grassroots leaders, etc., which are all embedded into one committee, and actually 3 committees. One is the protocol committee, which I'm part from, the campaigns committee, and the research committee. And we're all working together to define which are going to be the interventions that we're going to study, implement, and monitor for behavioral change concerns. So it started really bumpy because we didn't know how deep could we embed the behavioral change perspective into health matters. But right now that we're advancing, there's been quite a lot of evidence that is being gathered, and that we're trying to use to advocate with other states so that we can progressively embed it into other programs, into other offices of the government, into other health ministries, specifically for improving food systems, so we can promote better food consumption. So the right now the biggest threat or the biggest challenge, which is where I want to focus on right now, it's the sustainability one. We all know that sustainability is always the challenge. If it's not for because of money, if it's not because of funds, it may be for political will, for example. But right now, we're going through a political transition in Mexico. So what we have been doing is, how are we going to secure the buy-in of the Behavioral Change Commission with the new government? And I think that the solution is close, because I know that, for example, gathering just enough evidence to, show or sell to the next government would be quite enough, because it's actually it has proved worth. It has proved success, and I think that my 4 minutes are over, so I'm open to any questions, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for jumping in when Charles had connectivity issues. So Charles, we'll jump back now and over to you. And don't worry about putting on your camera because that might help your bandwidth. So over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Rohanna. I hope this time is the best. We are so happy to share our experience in using behavior science to support the nutrition program in Burkina Faso. Let me begin with some background information. In Burkina Faso, 72% of pregnant women suffer from anemia, and there are high rates of dropouts from antenatal care attendants, especially during the first and second quarter of pregnancy. To address these challenges, UNICEF is supporting government in supplementing pregnant women with multiple micronutrients tablets, as well as promoting antenatal care attendance. And behavioral science is being used to support the above mentioned interventions. Slide. There has been formative research that was carried out, and behavioral patterns of key stakeholders such as community health workers, healthcare workers, husbands, mothers-in-law, and other community leaders were identified and analyzed. These insights help to build a behavioral map illustrating the challenges and the opportunities regarding antenatal care attendance and multiple micronutrient supplementation. Slide. Behavioral dissection showed some major barriers. First, there was the lack of standardized interpersonal communication tool, as well as the low trust of pregnant women in healthcare workers. A solution to that was a standardized tool, a pocket guide that was designed to be used by all healthcare workers to improve communication and dialogue with pregnant women. Another tool designed was the pregnancy calendar, which is found on the right side of the slide, it's very beautifully designed with more illustrations and visuals and less writings. The calendar is to be used by pregnant women and there is provision for them to tick a box each day when they take the multiple micronutrients tablets. The calendar is easy to use, and even women who cannot read or write can use it. Rowena, the last slide. The impact of the intervention tools will be assessed in the field using a randomized control trial. There is a control group that will receive no intervention and 2 other groups who will receive the design tools. The 3 groups will be monitored to see the impact of the intervention. Now, as concerns challenges, I should say that no major challenge has been noticed so far, but working in a conflict area during the experimentation phase will certainly be challenging. And in terms of perspective, we will be happy to scale up the initiative if the outcome is positive. And before we end, let me acknowledge the technical support from NERCH Lebanon and Busara, the collaborative efforts by all stakeholders, and of course, the leadership of the Ministry of Health in Burkina Faso. We don't forget our management, the management of UNICEF, Burkina Faso. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Charles. And we're so glad that you managed to get your connection back. So just to summarize, you've heard, hopefully, and have enjoyed some of the strategies that we're using within the 4 UN organizations to shift human behavior. From the nudges that Courtney first talked about, like the buckets, trying to make things easy for people, from the IFAD presentation, which thought about the enabling conditions. We heard from Ivory about the image editing and how having that cultural images and having just the clear packaging really helped to sell the product. We've just heard from Charles about the priming through the calendar. And then finally, we've heard about how to really embed, because obviously behavioural science, as we heard from Courtney, it's an iterative process. And for it to be sustained, it has to be embedded in everything we do. So as we heard from the Mexico example, embedding it within a government to ensure that sustainability is one of the ways forward. So thank you very much. We're going to now stop for some questions. We've got about, I think we've got about 15 minutes left for any questions. So Joanna, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if I can pass over to you to read out the most popular question, please.
Thanks, Verna. Sure, happy to help with that. So friendly reminder to all colleagues that you're welcome to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you may have, and also vote on ones that you're interested in knowing the answers to. Let us start by taking the most popular one so far from Kazi to Rosa Maria, and he's wondering if the toolkit is public. Should be an easy one, Rosa Maria.
Thank you, Joanna. It's not public yet. It's not public yet. It's internally used by IFAD, but we are planning then to public, but it's not public yet, the toolkit.
Is it going to be public?
Yes.
Excellent. So please let us know. We're happy to amplify and make sure that it benefits everyone. We have a question around frameworks here. I'm trying to find the original one. There's a follow-up one. Helena Golden is wondering, I'm curious about the frameworks used to guide the identification of behaviors to address. How are the local needs identified and who identifies them? Helena didn't specify who the question was for, so I'm asking the panel to please step in. Who feels most up for answering this?
Courtney, would you like to go ahead, and then maybe Ivory about why the bread consumption was prioritized?
Sure, I could give a little more of an opening rather than a concrete answer, just to say that I think as I attempted to maybe respond to some of the Q&A, overall, we're looking in FAO at trying to be as model agnostic as we can, trying to use various models and tools based on what we see works and being iterative even in our tool process, so we don't get stuck in one framework or one methodology. However, we've been leaning a lot, especially as these are early pilots with early adopters of behavioral science. We've been leaning a lot on the East framework as a method, as an overarching idea for how to both scope barriers as well as design solutions. And in the specific example of the Busara examples in the field, we talked about, we used the Regional Decision Lab used the Create Action Funnel, which talks about behavioral cascades and mapping out behaviors, thinking about behavioral targets as an ensemble of procedures. So those are two that we've been working with a lot, but keen to hear more about and learn from other organizations what they're using and how they see those tools being useful.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Ivory, do you want to mention anything why the whole wheat was prioritised? Because there was 8 behaviours, as you mentioned, so why whole wheat was then prioritised? Sorry, I've put you on the spot.
No, it's absolutely fine. So I'm also distracted trying to answer all of the questions in the chat. So whole grain wheat was prioritized just because it was such a highly consumed product within Armenia. So if you were looking at the number of people who were consuming white wheat and then the number of entry points which we could have as WFP, because we have to recognize at one point, okay, this is where we have a unique value add and an opportunity to support the government to make a change here. So this is why we prioritize the whole grain component, because we could have a massive impact, not just on the nutrition consumption side, but then also on support to the value chain actors to really increase their production and therefore to reach some of those economic and social outcomes along the value chain. Just very quickly on frameworks as well, we did not take a one-size-fits-all approach. So this is very iterative, very organic, and very much based on co-creation within the teams in which you're working, and then also with the communities which you're working with. So we heavily invested in research, and then we heavily invested in co-creation, and then finally in economic kind of return on an analysis to understand where the social and the economic intersections were for impact, so that we could then have the most likely success for the project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivory. And just whilst I have you, and I have my glasses on now so I can actually read the questions, and there is a question: how has WFP applied systems innovation in ensuring an effective food supply chain? Is there anything you want to add around, you've kind of touched on it, but is there anything you want to add around that?
Yeah, I think the key component here is an integrated approach. So what you need to make sure is you're not kind of working in silos. So say like a livelihood and resilience team doing this and a nutrition team doing that, and perhaps a supply chain doing something else, but instead coming together to together understand what a problem is, and therefore coming together to the solution, to really have a systems approach to just see where, if you're doing all of this change at the individual or the community or the household level, how you can then together have like a snowball effect into the systems level. So a really simple example of this, beyond the one just given, is investments in food safety standards. Maybe you're doing all of this very small support as a resilience and livelihoods team to smallholder farmers, and maybe in nutrition you're really getting it to that consumer, but to have that massive snowball effect, if you just make those small investments support into meeting minimum food safety standards, so that a smallholder farmer cooperative can be considered for WFP procurement allowance, then you have a massive snowball effect, not just on the cooperative, but then also on the individuals who are consuming that healthier food. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivory. Courtney, I think you're typing a response to this question, but I think it's very interesting. The question is from Rebecca on a measuring risk.
Okay.
What other options other than the balloon test could be used? I was typing exactly, quote, "This is $1 million question, Rebecca. Thanks for asking it." We haven't had the chance to delve deeper into that question yet. And it's really foremost on our minds. This is the classic tool we've all been trained in behavioral science to use, and it's kind of the BART, balloon test. Some of the ideas that came up from the field were really just spitballing. We're just intuitive responses to the results we were seeing. So we did, in all honesty, we didn't test more iteratively or think of other designs. But the main idea that was coming across was that this balloon idea was just so detached from the cultural reality of the communities we were working with, that we would need to think of some other activity, some other object that or process that's more socially and culturally normative in the area. So we haven't thought of anything specific, but that would be an excellent research project, and maybe we could partner together on it. Thank you so much. And Courtney, just whilst I've got you with your camera on, and then I'll ask the other panelists as well. There's a fantastic question, and this is really the million-dollar question, I'm afraid. What is the future of behavioural science within the food system? You know, is there something that's not being done? Is there something missing? What's the next frontier? So Courtney, whilst I've put you on the spot, whilst your camera is on, I will come to you first on that.
Honored to attempt to answer this question, or rather just lead to more questions. I think this is really a critical area that we're all thinking about, and behavioral science, not just in food systems, but overall, you know, made headlines through micro nudges that had huge impact in small populations. And we're really fascinated by what sounds like an illogical or surprising change in context that results in a change in behavior. Priming and the replication crisis around that is like foremost in my mind. So how do we transition from small pilots and specific examples to something bigger in a systems thinking approach? My attempt, or my hypothesis that I think we're trying to pilot in the Office of Innovation and find partners to do it, is to translate behavioral science from, of course, in a methodology and a scientific approach for diagnosing problems and designing and testing solutions, but also I'm thinking about the innovation mindset as a key factor in how upstream actors, as well as everyone in the food system, thinks about and is able to approach problems from a new perspective. Being stuck in our defaults, over-reliance on rational thinking and knowledge-based transfer ideas has kept us from, let's say, having a lot of impact that we could have. And I think behavioral science, the more people that experience it, the more people that can participate in it, the more likely that behavioral thinking as a way towards innovating and thinking of new problems and empathizing with stakeholders, the more likely the decisions and activities and programs we design down the road will be more impactful. So a bit philosophical, but I think that's a really important trajectory we're moving towards. At least I hope.
Thank you, Courtney. Any other thoughts on that from the other panel members? I can't see anyone else's camera on. Charles, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rowana. I think it's been a wonderful experience. I think the future of behavior science is bright. As Courtney said, we are learning. We've learned a lot. We see that the process is a little bit long for now, but I think when we strengthen the capacity of national stakeholders, I think we'll be able to move ahead very fast with some of the processes. I think we're taking a lot of time now, maybe because it's still very new to us, but I'm sure that when we get more knowledge and skills in that, and it is important because it gets us really down to, focusing more on what are really the needs of the people and getting really closer to the community. So I think the future is very bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Charles, just whilst I've got you online, there's a question: were there any efforts to utilise human-centred design to inform the MMS used in the trial to reduce the barriers? So there's a question for you. Do you want to just add something quickly in relation to that question?
Yes, human-centered design was used, and let me just take a quick example. The packaging was done after a formative research that was done on the field to ask pregnant women what they want as colors, what they want as packaging, and so on. So it was designed with them, the packaging of micronutrients tablets. That's just an example to show that human-centered design was used. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And I think we've got time for one more question. How do you use monitoring and evaluation for behaviour change programs using behavioural science? Is there any common indicators? Is there any thoughts from any of the panel members around that?
Well, probably I can jump in.
Please do.
Yeah, so monitoring and evaluation plans around behavior change or around behavioral science have to do with different technologies of the mind. That can be knowledge, that can be attitude, that can be practice, that can be intention, that can be auto-efficacy, which is it's a whole range of different things we can measure. And although it's not that easy to identify a good measuring tool, because there are a lot of them, some can be qualitative, some can be quantitative, coding and standardizing all the information that you gather from interviews, from exploratory approaches, can help you build on that. And it actually depends on the objective. Are you trying to change the attitude? You should ask certain questions. If you're trying to change the practice, you should ask or observe different things. So I think monitoring and evaluation is about making the right questions, about the right objectives you have towards your audience or towards your subjects of your study. So there's a big guide on how to do this, if not easily, quite intuitively, which is the behavioral drivers model, which is UNICEF's framework for designing behavioral change intervention. So I would suggest that it's open, it's public, and there's going to be like you'll have a really, really good approach to see how we measure and how we ensure that impact is embedded into the intervention that we are designing around it.
Thank you so much. And if you could share the link to that, because it is public,
sure,
in the chat, whilst I just close up, that would be great. I'm afraid we've run out of time for any more questions, but thank you so much, everybody, for attending. The speakers are going to try and answer as many of these questions still in this Q&A section now. I can see some people are still typing. So thank you, everybody, again for attending, and for all the speakers, and for Joanna and her colleagues at UN Innovations for bringing this all together. So as we have now run out of time, that's it from us, and thank you again. Take care. Bye.